Hi, in this video we are going to see how we will be putting data from the form into the DB, right? Whatever we type here in the form, whatever data we enter should go back and be available in the or get stored in the VCA DB. Now we are going to learn this concept by the means of a simple form. So here what I have is I have a form in which I have a menu item. You can use a text box and then just type in the item. What I have done here is I populated it from the config form. You need another text box for price. I have used an incrementer for quantity. You are again free to use a text box. And finally, total. Total, of course, I have calculated as the product of price and quantity. Like I said, you are free to fill up all of these manually. Additionally, I have date and I also have city. So this is a simple form. And what I would like to do is when I run this form as a process, that is from the dashboard, then this data gets stored in the database. So to do that, the first thing I have to do is I have to indicate in the system that this particular form is from. So once we have the form ready, then the next step is to convert it into a process that is available in the dashboard. So that is going to be the final thing that we are trying to achieve here. Now, this typically represents a transaction. Let's imagine we are going to a hotel and we are trying to pay the price for something we have bought. So since this is a transaction, we will store it in what we call as a transaction code. So we go here into VCA and we find the transaction code, attribute creation, transaction code. Now in under single variables, we create the variables string, menu item string, then you have big integer, item price, integer, then you create big integer, item quantity, integer, then you create one more which is total price, big integer. These should ideally be decimals, but yeah, for the demo, so just take these as. So now that you have these four variables, go ahead, click on save. We can also have a date variable, sale date dt, and sale location as a string. So now we have all of these transaction code variables. Go ahead and click on save. Now, what we need to do is we need to establish a correlation between these AI action form variables and the corresponding transaction code variables. We do this through a process called business variable mapping. Now, before we actually get into business variable mapping, since we want to map it to a transaction code, in the form, we must capture a unique ID that is given to each transaction, which is called as TCID or transaction code ID. So here, the first time we are using the hidden section, I drag a text box in here. I change the label to self.tcid. I attach the system variable, so you can still select the action forms. I really don't think that makes a difference. System variable self.tcid. So we have the self.tcid variable here. Okay. Now, when we do this business variable mapping, once the mapping is over, we need this event to take place. So there are different ways of getting this into the database. Commonly what we use is called as insert update. So here put a button, and to this button, right? Buttons are usually used for clicking. So there are events related to button. Whenever this button is triggered, then we will add an event that is called as TS insert update, which basically means we insert or update the data from a transaction style. All right, so you have TS insert update here. You don't need to click anywhere. Enable synchronous execution is kind of to not have an asynchronous mode. Enable TC creation is because this will be the first process we'll be running. We will enable the creation of a transaction code. Additionally, auto trigger on submit. This means when I submit this form, even if I don't click on this button, whatever event is given as part of this button, that event should trigger. These things are a little bit difficult to understand. So for now, let's just try to go through the steps. Add a button here. To the button, add the event. Click on Enable Synchronous Execution. Click on Enable TC Creation and Auto Trigger on Submit. Now the form is ready. Let's go ahead, click on Save. Then let's go to Transaction Style Mapping. Now here we find the transaction style that we had created. Click on Edit. Find the form. Make sure the form is visible in blue. Click on Save. Now, what happens at this point in VCA terminology is the form that we selected has become the init form or the starting form for this transaction style. And subsequently, there could be more forms in this transaction style, which will be called as state forms. State forms we will look at after a few classes. So right now, all you need to know is this, because I have clicked here and attached the form to the process. This is called as the init form. Next step is to do the business variable mapping. The business variable mapping kind of establishes a 1:1 correspondence between the data I have entered in the form and where I wanted to land in the database. So here I wanted to land on the transaction code as we discussed. My form has only single variables. I need to search the variables here. So I think we have a menu item. Then we have a item price. We have an item quantity. Menu item. We have an item price. I believe we have a date, sale date. We also have a sale location, I believe, and item quantity and a total price, if I remember correctly. So now you can see what I have done is from the transaction code, I have selected the variables in which the data from the action form has to be stored. So these are what you would think of as your backend variables. And I am going to do a mapping so that corresponding to every front end variable, there is a backend variable so that the values I enter in the front end get stored in the backend. So for that, click on add. Now I have selected my base table. Now I have to select which row in the base table this data should go to. So I set the base table ID. This is where the self.tcid comes, because that in the transaction code table, this particular transactions code is where this data should go. I put self.tcid here. Now here I'm going to pick up, see, AI action form. So transaction code item quantity gets mapped to AI action form item quantity. The name gets mapped to the name. Then we have the price. Price gets mapped to the price. Date gets mapped to the date. It's called place. Yeah, I think I probably called supplier city. And we have total price. Just map it to total, right? So as you can see, these are your front-end variables or form variables. These are your back-end variables. So here in quantity, if you write 3 on the transaction code, the value for this particular variable will be stored as 3. Now let's go ahead, click on Save All. Okay, so let's quickly recollect the steps we have done so far. We created a form, we attached AI action form variables, we put in formulae where required. Once we completed that, we decided that this was a transaction. So we created transaction code variables. For every AI action form variable, we created a corresponding transaction code variable. Once that was completed, we came back to the form. We added one hidden text box for storing the self.tcid, which is the identification of the process that we will run. And secondly, we created a button. To the button, we added one event called TS insert update. And after that, we said auto trigger on submit, check. Enable synchronous execution, check. Enable TC creation, check. Now we come to the final part, which is getting this process to show up on the dashboard. So right now, if you see here, there is no training VR, which is the name of my classification, TCTS classification. So I go to AI configuration, go to relationship configuration, go to transaction style mapping, and then go to self. Please remember these steps. Once again, relationship configuration, transaction style mapping, and self. Here, click on the attach icon, find the transaction style you want to attach, click on plus, make sure it's showing up here, and done. Now when you go back to the dashboard, you can see training VR. You can see the form that we created. Let's have 3 pizzas. And then, as you can see, these boxes are empty right now. When we click on start, this indicates that the process has completed, but it is important for us to verify whether this process is really completed and whether the data has inserted. So to see some data from the database, we go to attribute value creation, we go to transaction code, and in transaction code, I see that a process has been initiated, but to see the values of the variables, just like config form, we need to attach the variables first. Let us look at menu item, quantity, we ordered 3 pizzas. Item quantity, then we had price. So here we have the item price and the total price. Then we had sale date and sale location. Click on save. Now these 6 single variables have been attached. To see the values of the variables, click on plus, and here if you see this 1 and the value pizza free, item price, the total price, the sale date, and the location string we did not map correctly, but if this data shows up here, that means your insertion into the database, inserting data into the database has completed successfully. This is a user-friendly way of showing the data. The data actually resides in the MySQL database. I do understand this video is a little long and a bit confusing. I will see if I can record a better one later, but for now, this is it. Thank you.